Hello and welcome to the European Dialogue, brought to you by the EU Values Network. Join us to understand more about the European Union's approach to foreign policy, democracy, and European values through insightful discussions with experts from our network. Funded by the European Union's Erasmus Plus programme and part of the Jean Monnet network, we bring together over 100 academics from across the globe to challenge, debate, and enlighten us. I'm Emily Jones, and I'm pleased to guide you through the complex yet fascinating world of EU foreign policy. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's podcast, where we're diving into the complexities of international politics to explore the recent scholarly discussions on the EU's response to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Joining us is the Jean Monnet Chair, Professor Elisabeth Johansson-Nogués, whose main area of research is the European Union's foreign and security policy, with a special focus on relations between the EU and neighbouring countries to the east and to the south. Together with Francesca Leso, Elisabeth has recently published a very insightful article in the Journal of Common Market Studies, which we will link to in the description of this podcast. It's titled Geopolitical EU, the EU's wartime assistance to Ukraine. And today we will discuss their findings and the broader implications for the EU's foreign policy and values. So, welcome Elisabeth. Great to have you on the show today. Can you start us off perhaps by giving a brief description of the argument in your article, please?
Of course. The article explores the EU's humanitarian, economic, energy and military assistance to Ukraine through the lens of critical geopolitics. We wanted to know if there's been a distinct shift in the EU's foreign policy in the wake of the war in Ukraine, in particular if the EU has become more geopolitical in its thinking and its actions towards Eastern Europe, as has been argued by then High Representative and Vice President Josep Borrell. Our findings in the article point to a mixed picture. The EU's political leaders' perceptions of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and itself as an actor in the region appears to have shifted quite significantly since the inception of the war. The EU appears to believe that it needs to be much more engaged in Eastern Europe compared to what it used to be. However, although there is a will for more substantial EU engagement, it is not likely that the EU will assume a firm geopolitical leadership role and step into the vacuum that Russia has created in the Eastern European security order.
Super interesting. Yeah, so in the article, we know you and Francesca, you argue that EU leaders have come to understand the war in Ukraine as not simply a military conflict, but also as a symbolic battle for values. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by this?
Yes. So several EU leaders, such as most notably the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and also then President of the European Council, Charles Michel, and Borrell, they have on numerous occasions stated that they view the war in Ukraine not merely as about territorial conquest and political influence with tragic consequences for the Ukrainian people, but also as a fight for a set of almost diametrically opposed values. For most EU member states, the Russian invasion is interpreted as an aggressive attempt to thwart Ukraine's progress towards becoming a more democratic country, where human rights and the rule of law is respected. As we know, democracy and human rights, the rule of law and good governance are also some of the central principles that the EU itself stands for. The Russian attack on Ukraine establishes thus in EU leaders' mind that a parallel attack on the EU values has been taking place. Michel has for this reason stated that the war in Ukraine is a fight to uphold our common European principles, values and democratic rights. So, set against a larger context, we also have to remember that the war in Ukraine unfolds against a backdrop of a trend of the last decade where both democratic rule and human rights are losing ever more ground to authoritarian and repressive regimes globally. One could argue that the battle for values unleashed in Ukraine is thus symbolical of a larger concern in the EU, that its liberal value system is becoming an increasing rarity in the world.
Wow, yeah, it's rather alarming. I know that in the article too, you discuss how the war represents a struggle for other significant values. Perhaps you can elaborate on those for our listeners and explain why they are particularly concerning then for the EU, for Eastern Europe and our global community.
Yes, it's true. The EU also sees the war in Ukraine as a symbolic battle for another set of norms and principles that is central to its member states' action in and understanding of the world. Putin's attack on Ukraine violates many internationally held principles and norms such as sovereignty, self-determination, territorial integrity, inviolability of borders, and pacific resolution of conflict. In some EU capitals, there is thus a concern that the very fundaments of the current international order, as epitomized by the Charter of the United Nations, will unravel, and with it, any prospects for small states, like most EU member states, to have a fair state over how global matters are managed in a multiple world order where great powers, not the UN, decide the future of humankind.
Wow. Yeah, fascinating. And well, do you think then this has influenced the way that the EU's identity and its role on the global stage is seen by other countries?
That's an excellent question, Emily. I wish I had a clear answer for you. I think that for now it's too early to tell. It's too early to tell what the long-term consequences for the EU's foreign and security policy will be. I think the only thing we can say for certain at this stage is that the EU's political leaders are very concerned about the 2022 Russian invasion into Ukraine and its implications for the fundamental values that underpins the EU's foreign and security policy. If the EU loses this symbolical fight for values on the battlefields of Ukraine, it's likely to find itself increasingly marginalized in international politics and lose its relative normative foreign policy influence over third countries around the world. It is also true that many global South countries have accused the EU of being hypocritical, as it bemoans the attack on values in Ukraine while seemingly unwilling to speak up for human rights in and the Pacific resolution in the context of the 2023 conflict in Gaza.
Super interesting. And well, that is actually all we have time for today, but thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights, Elisabeth. It's been a really enlightening discussion to understand more about the EU's evolving role and the broader implications of the conflict today. We very much appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. Stay tuned for more episodes where we will bring you conversations with leading experts in the field. Until next time, take care and stay informed.